This is a Renegade Media Network podcast.
Obviously, you guys know I prefer organizations that flow counter to the mainstream narrative, and I've got the perfect one to tell you about. That would be Texas Scorecard. They were founded back in 2015 by a former Ron Paul congressional press secretary. They are Texas-based, Texas-focused counter-culture media organization. How cool is this? They've got podcasts, videos, live programming, a really nice print edition. They've got guest commentaries, very popular daily email newsletter that will highlight the biggest stories of the day. You can actually trust these guys without the mainstream leftist spin put on much of the news we unfortunately see these days. Their mission: disrupt statism and reconstitute self-governance. They do not want a seat at the table. They want to get rid of the table. They are pro-citizen. They will be your one-stop shop for Texas politics and news. That is for damn sure. I actually mean that because lately I wanted to know some of the stuff that was going on here. I DM'd Texas Scorecard to find out what was going on. They serve those who are tired of being lied to by the mainstream media. That would be you. That would be me as well. They do not align with any party. They work hard to hold lawmakers on both sides of the aisle accountable. Their reporting was directly responsible for taking down the corrupt Republican Speaker of the House, Dennis Bonnen. And check this out. The coolest part of this: nonprofit, no paywalls. All of the reporting is always free. You can find them on any social media channel by searching Texas Scorecard. Facebook.com/Texas Scorecard, Twitter @Texas Scorecard, and then they're on YouTube as well, YouTube.com/Texas Scorecard. You can find their free daily newsletter. Sign up for it over at TexasMinute.com. Go check out Texas Scorecard. You will not be disappointed.
You are now listening to the Counterflow Podcast, a place for dissonant voices and unapproved opinions.
You get split in fucking half, cause I call him the hologram graph, but I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lorditis, but I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Here is your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson.
What's up, you guys? Welcome back once again to the Counterflow Podcast. Great to have you with us. I hope this finds you well wherever you are. What a beautiful day here in Lockhart, Texas. I'm about to go enjoy a margarita after I finish this episode. Before we get to the guest today, let me quickly address something that came up from my episode with James Corbett a couple of weeks ago, about 19 minutes in, and you guys know where I'm going with this. James took a subtle jab, maybe not subtle, I don't know, plenty of you noticed it, a jab at the great Tom Woods. And that got some feedback sent my way, and not negative toward me necessarily, but like, wow, why did James do that kind of thing? However, even a small percentage of that feedback, and I saw some on Twitter, some people were saying, well, when you watched the video, Buck looked so elated and joyful and clapped his hands and said yes or thank you when James started going down this road, mentioning a 3x5 index card of allowable opinion. And so he must not like Tom, and et cetera, et cetera. Those are people I can tell that don't listen to me on a regular basis, because those who do, including my friend Jose, No Way Jose, pointed out, I think Buck thought he was going down a different route when he said the 3x5 index card of allowable opinion. And that's because, yes, I did think he was going down a different route. And that is because, as you guys know who listen to me on a regular basis, many times I have stated that even libertarians can have their own little 3x5 index card of allowable opinion. I do believe that, and no, that's not a reference to Tom Woods himself. Yes, I'm borrowing a phrase that he seemed to have coined. That's a tribute to his popularity, because that phrase has become ubiquitous in our vernacular. And so, yes, I'm borrowing the phrase. No, I am not ever targeting Tom when I say it. And so I thought that James was kind of referencing that, meaning that, yeah, even libertarians can get their understanding of the structures of power wrong. That's why I was elated, because I've made the same point many times. However, then he started going down the road of the charts and graphs about COVID and the quizzes. That's where, if you also notice my face, I was like, whoa, because I didn't think he was going there. In fact, my friend Tim is one of the guys, as the guy that helped Tom put those quizzes together, a personal friend of mine. So I've got nothing against the quizzes. I've got nothing against Tom Woods. I've got nothing but respect for the great Tom Woods. And I apologize if there was any misunderstanding. And I wouldn't be doing this if it were not for Tom Woods. Not only his books that I had years ago, but his show. And then I now have the same producer as Tom Woods, and I certainly wouldn't have the great Chris doing this show, producing it over at Podsworth Media without Tom. So my apologies to anyone that thought I was elated when someone took a jab at Tom. That is certainly not the case. Now, speaking of Tom, he used to have this show called Contra Krugman with my guest today, Robert Murphy. You may know him as Bob Murphy. He is a senior fellow with the Mises Institute, author of many great books, host of the Bob Murphy Show. I could really, if I wanted to read his resume, it would take quite a long time. So I won't get into that. He's going to give you a quick intro on himself as we start this, but I bet you don't always associate Bob with talking about Texas secession, and that's what he's here to talk about. He's got a new book, kind of a pamphlet-style book about Texas secession, and that's what we're going to talk about here today. So, without further ado, Bob Murphy is with us today. Bob, welcome to the show. I'm glad to finally have you here.
Thanks for having me, Buck. Glad to be here.
Yeah, we're going to talk about Texas secession, which a lot of my audience, I'm pretty sure they're quite familiar with you, but maybe not within the context of talking about Texas secession. But it is your first time on my show, so for those of my audience that have been under a rock and are saying, who's Bob Murphy? Give them a quick intro on who you are and what you do.
Sure. So I'm an economist of the Austrian School of Economics. I'm sure your listeners know what that is. I got my degree at New York University. I taught at Hillsdale for a few years. Right now, I have several affiliations, but I'm a senior fellow with the Mises Institute. I'm sure many of your listeners know who they are. And I was actually at Texas Tech for a few years out in Lubbock. So, I'm originally from upstate New York, so I'm a Yankee, but I did live in Texas for a few years, so I have a little bit of knowledge of the culture down there. And so like I said, I have a lot of books on like economic theory, on libertarianism, just explaining how does the free market work to the general public. But more recently, yes, with the condition the country is in and where things look like they're going, I have thought that it's the states breaking away is really the only viable midterm solution, and Texas to me seemed like the obvious candidate to be the first one to go.
Don't look now, but there was a cat trying to get into your...
know.
I love that. As we go, see you guys who only listen to the audio version, you miss out on so much. So yeah, this surprised me. So we have the same producer, and he wrote to me and said, Bob Murphy's got a new, I guess we can call it for now, an ebook on Texas secession called Common Sense, the Case for an Independent Texas. And you kind of alluded to it in your opening remarks there that the condition of the country, you could see where things maybe are headed. What specifically about Texas gave you this idea? Because a lot of people are saying, well, maybe Florida and DeSantis will kind of break off on their own.
Right.
What is it about Texas that gave you this idea?
Sure. So I should say that it's not that I'm opposed to Florida doing it as well. Also, I'm friends with a lot of people in New Hampshire, and they've got what they call the Free State Project. And I don't want to mischaracterize them. Some of the people there, from day one, they thought, the goal is we're going to get a critical mass and then vote to leave. Other people just thought, no, it's not political. It's just as long as your neighbors think like you and you're going to practice agorism, it doesn't matter what the government's. So, they have different views as to what does that mean there. But to come back to your question, I've always been of the opinion that being able to secede from a broader political unit is in every person's right to do so. And, that's not some weird Rothbardian position. That's, Declaration of Independence. But, and in the U.S., when it lectures other countries around the world for, hey, let your dissidents go and stop crackdowns, that's the same view they're relying on. But in terms of the U.S. situation, the reason I think Texas makes sense, and so in the pamphlet, I go through this in detail as to why it is, but I said if we're talking about one state breaking away, then clearly it's got to be have an outside boundary, that it's got to be, border either land or ocean to be able to have commerce and stuff with the rest of the world. Otherwise, it'd be too easy for the U.S. government just to encircle them if things, went sideways. And so, on that score, Florida could, but technically the reason, just strategically, I think Texas makes more sense. But number one, Texas is bigger, as have bigger population, bigger economy. And so just in terms of being able to stand on its own and, make it costlier if the U.S. government did want to make things get ugly, there's that element. But also Florida, if the U.S. government wanted to, could just blockade it with a, naval blockade. Whereas with Texas, they would also have to try to, for one thing, there's two oceans they'd have to close off, and also, of course, the whole border with Mexico. And so if Texas were to formally announce that, hey, now we're an independent country, then they could have commerce with Mexico, and the U.S. government, if they wanted to come in and block that off, they would be interfering with the sovereign country of Mexico as well. It wouldn't just be construed as an internal dispute the way they could just have a close naval blockade around Florida. So those are the main reasons that, if you're saying, why. But the other thing too is Texans have this, or some people say Texian, like, because that was the term that they used back then, that it was its own country,
right,
for a while there. And so that's, and the more significant thing, regardless of the history, is that Texans care about that. I remember Phil Magnus one time when I was at Texas Tech, came to give a lecture, and he said, hey, how many people here, he's talking to the students at Texas Tech, how many people here are actually from Texas? Half the kids raise their hand. He goes, yeah, the greatest country in the world. And everybody laughed and clapped. Yeah. Right. So that's, kids from other states don't think like that. Or a different example, I heard that, some people from Texas, if they're like traveling in Europe and someone says, hey, where are you from? They don't say the U.S. or America. They say Texas. Whereas if I were traveling and someone said, where were you from? I wouldn't say New York, meaning New York State. That wouldn't even occur. I would say, from the U.S. So those are some of the reasons that I thought if a region is going to break away and it is going to make sense that it could be its own system, Texas is obviously the place to start.
When you first, I know you're not in Texas at the moment. When you did move to Texas as an outsider, so to speak, did you, I hear this from other outsiders, oh my God, I've never seen a state with this much pride in their own state, meaning like their flags were everywhere. It's Texas Ford and Texas Chevrolet. Right. Did you notice that?
Yes. So not so much the flag. I mean, I'm not disagreeing with you about the flag, but the thing that struck me was, and I was just talking with students, and they were mentioning how, like, growing up in Texas, they learned a lot about Texas history. Like, that was a core part of the curriculum, whereas, I grew up in upstate New York, and in our history, no, we didn't deal with the history of New York State. Like, that wasn't a thing. And so yes, to answer your question, that did strike me. And just so your listeners know, I was in Lubbock, and then also I had an apartment in Houston for family reasons. And so I would make that trip a lot. And so I spent a lot of time in both Houston and Lubbock so I did get a mix of, like, a big city in Texas and also a smaller one, and just to get an idea of how big Texas was. Because, that's a long trip just to go there. And most other states, if you're driving that long, you're not still in the state.
We, as growing up here, we said a pledge allegiance to the Texas flag as we, before maybe or right after the pledge allegiance to the American flag when we're in school growing up. I always thought, I think we're the only people that do that. You start off in the book by discussing... Yeah, I
mean, just as a quick, like, I don't even know what the New York State flag looks like, let alone did we pledge allegiance to it. I have no idea what it looks like.
Okay. You start in the book by discussing the two Americas, and I think that should be obvious that we've got that situation going on at the moment. I used to say, it seems like we're seeing the same movie with two different versions of what we just watched, and now it seems like we're not even looking at the same screen anymore. It's not even the same movie. It's so different. And I hear sometimes of people on CNN, and you'll see, these tweets we all seem to have poke fun at online, and it's like they're in a different, I don't even know where they're coming from most of the time. How do you think we've arrived at this point?
Well, yeah, so let me just underscore what you just said, because obviously, like CNN or NPR or something, they always had what we would have called a bias. But when Trump came in, I mean, it really it turned into open advocacy.
Yeah.
And like I remember when there was a piece on NPR, I was actually driving around Houston when this happened. I remember where I was in the car when it happened, and they openly explained to their viewers how, we're not just going to parrot what the president says in his press release or his conferences without, and so it was when they started using the terminology or the phrasing, when they'd say, the president claimed falsely, where they would just editorialize and just tell you that, no, we're reporting, the news of what the U.S. president just said, but we're going to tell you that's a false statement. And they wouldn't do that with any other world leader. So
Right.
One would have thought the only person on planet Earth who regularly lies is Donald Trump. And that's the one, person that NPR is going to reuse that language for. And so obviously that's crazy. Up till then, they would just report. If they wanted to give the other side, they would have some expert on, or they would quote, the Democrat majority leader or something like that to give the other perspective so that you could have both sides. But they wouldn't, the person reading the news would not pause to tell you that what was just said was a false statement. Like, that's just not how the news worked. And like I said, I remember they explicitly explained to their viewers that this is the decision we've made now because, Trump is blah, blah, blah. That's why we force it. So there's that. And then another thing too is right when this pamphlet, when I was getting ready to release it, the NFL decided to have two national anthems. I mean, so again, what more has to happen for those people who are saying, oh, no, this is just, people are angry. Hey, it was like this in the 60s. It'll blow over. Like, no, there really are two Americas at this point. And so, how did we get that? I mean, I'm not going to say anything novel here, Buck, but I think, it's, as people say, Trump was extremely polarizing.
Yeah.
It's gotten worse with every president, right? So I'm in my mid-40s. I can remember with Bill Clinton, people were on the left were angry at the right-wingers and how much they demonized Bill Clinton. Hey, it's not really they disagree with his policy, but they're making it like he's a bad man. And then, of course, George W. Bush is the war criminal, and and he's the worst person on earth. And then, so it just, with every president, the animosity and hostility just got amped up. So it was, my wife and I, when we watched Trump versus Biden, that debate, and we got the flavor of it, we went just for kicks and looked at the Nixon-Kennedy, the Nixon-Kennedy debates just to see. I mean, the contrast was so enormous that you couldn't even imagine. Just, they used to do a better job of being statesman-like or whatever. The U.S. government still did stuff that I would think was horrible, but they at least put on a better show of decorum. Whereas now, they don't even, like I say, the news now doesn't even pretend that they're giving you accurate stuff. It's just, here's, what you need to know about this evil guy, Donald Trump. So, and I think Facebook and things like that obviously have catered to, giving people bifurcated news that everyone goes to get their fix of, what's our side saying and then what's the other side doing. And it's almost like you log in to Twitter or something hoping to see something crazy from your opponents because you get a thrill from it. Like, oh, I hate them so much.
Yes. Have you seen any public polling on within Texas on how people here feel about the thought of secession or the possibility even?
I haven't looked recently. I did. It was interesting. There was a time. So I did a talk on this topic when I was actually at Texas Tech. So this was a few years ago. And it was let me think. It was was it before? I'm hoping I'm not getting my time. It was before Trump first won. Okay. And it was going into that election. I remember I saw polling, and it was the kind of thing where I don't remember the exact numbers, but I think it was like in the 40-some% of Texans were at least open to the idea. And what's funny is in California, it was 40-some% were open to the idea of California breaking away if Donald Trump won.
Yes.
And then in the Texan, it was if Hillary Clinton won. And so it was interesting that both sides recognized, at some point, if this person that you think is a cartoonish villain were to seize control of the federal government, maybe instead of just saying, well, let's campaign harder next time, like to realize, why don't we just extricate ourselves from this system? Because this is really messed up.
What's up, Counterflow audience? If you're listening to this show, obviously you're a person who cares about their liberty. You may even be one of these people that's kind of tired of waiting around for political change, tired of being upset by the same old from the LP, tired of all of this nonsense while you think, what should I really be doing? If you're ready to take matters into your own hands, then I want to tell you about a new community called the Nomad Network. The Nomad Network is the #1 community for liberty-minded people just like you and me who want to create freedom in their lifetime by focusing on the things that you can actually change: entrepreneurship, investment, and income mobility. The people over at the Nomad Network, Jason Stapleton, these guys are preaching how to actually make your life more free and better without having to join a political party and go through the same old motions year after year. Whether you have an existing business, looking to start one, or simply want to network with other like-minded people, the Nomad Network is the place for you. The best part is, obviously, everyone likes this. It's free to join. You hear me? Free to join. Go to www.nomadnetwork.app/buck right now to see what everyone is talking about. That is www.nomadnetwork.app/buck to get your free account today. See you there. Are you familiar with the Texas nationalist movement and the term Texit that they're trying to get out in popular vernacular?
Yeah, so I mean, I did reference that. I did use that once, that term. So yes, I know that, and it's like obvious analogy with Brexit.
Yes.
And I like doing that too, because it sort of, to me, diffuses the hysteria. As I argue in the pamphlet, like one issue was, well, hey, wouldn't this cause a civil war again? And I was like, well, when Brexit happened, some people were arguing there might be a trade war, but nobody worried, well, gee, continental Europe going to launch cruise missiles into London? Like, that just would have been insane. No, if a group wants to break away from another one politically, you don't get to start blowing them up. And so likewise, so I do like that phrase of Texit. One thing though too is just in terms of, I don't know if you want to call it branding or marketing or whatnot, but so talking with you and other people who have been in this for a while, of course I'm comfortable using the term secession, but
yeah,
I don't lead with that because it is, for a lot of Americans, the only thing they know of secession is, the U.S. war between the states, for Southerners. Whereas I call it Texas independence, because that's really what it is too, that the war for U.S. independence was also a secessionist movement away from Great Britain, but that's not how it's been branded. And also they are, two sides of the same coin. So yeah, I am, to answer your question, I'm familiar with Texit. I'm only somewhat recent into this area because I'm more was just someone who thought, I just want to teach the ideas of liberty and how free markets work, and I'll let other people who want to be political activists go ahead and do what they will with that. My job is just to convince the public of how a free society would operate. But like I say, things got so bad that I thought, and there were some logistical issues of, and I don't know if you want to get into this stuff. If a state were to break away, like what would you do with Social Security and stuff that I thought, I should, actually I could weigh in on this, and so that's partly why. So yeah, I'm aware of the Texas people. I hadn't been in communication with them except sort of, to give them a nod and, hey, good luck over there, fellas. But now I am getting more into it.
Yeah, well, I want to get into some of that stuff because I've been into this topic, and when I discuss it with a quote unquote normie, there's always these kind of similar concerns they bring up every time. And I think it's natural now that we realize people care more about safety, even more so than quote unquote liberty. They want to feel safe. And sometimes we're trying to convince them that liberty is the safe route. But there's always concerns. Well, what about Social Security? And in fact, my parents have told me this. Funny, they're quote unquote conservative, but they are concerned about their Social Security, and they're of that age. If, let's say, in a year from now, there's this process to get Texas its independence, and they're going to grant us that, if we can even use that term, what would something like Social Security, what would that look like? And because they're going to say, well, I paid in, and it's not fair if I don't get it, and if we break away, that we're not going to get it. What would that look like?
So one thing is just to let, especially for the younger listeners to know, and I realize it's not addressed to your parents, that the Social Security and Medicare systems are utterly bankrupt. And even, and I quote this in the pamphlet, even according to the government's own actuaries or the trustee report that recently came out, I'm just looking at it. So over a 75-year horizon, Social Security and Medicare have a combined $68 trillion shortfall, right? Meaning they would need $68 trillion right now to start investing and rolling over, earning interest to be able to fund the mismatch between, workers, payroll contributions, and Medicare premiums going forward and the outgoing benefit checks. They would need $68 trillion right now just to plug that gap over the next 75 years. So clearly, younger people now who are paying into the system, they're not going to get their promised benefits. That's mathematically not going to happen. So what I said though in the pamphlet is at first that did seem like a hard question, but then I realized, well, no, it's actually conceptually pretty easy. Right now, under the existing system, if a U.S. citizen decides, you know what, I want to go live in France, and moves to France and then changes his citizenship, he still gets, his Social Security payments. He doesn't get Medicare, but that's not because he renounced his citizenship. It's because Medicare is only going to fund U.S.-based healthcare, right? But you still, there's formulas and stuff like that. You got to have eligibility requirements. But in general, if you leave the U.S., you don't lose your accumulated, Social Security benefits. And so I was saying, conceptually, then it should be the same thing, like to just handle it simply without changing rules and come up with arbitrary procedures. If all of a sudden a bunch of people who currently live in Dallas then become citizens of a foreign country, namely the Republic of Texas, it's the same thing. They just say, okay, I'm living in a different country now, but still, I'm going to get my Social Security benefits just like I would have had I remained in the U.S. So to me, that's conceptually how it. Now, you could say, well, the U.S. government might be mad and not do that. I can't control what the U.S. government does to retaliate. But in terms of the accounting or the logistics, they do have procedures in place right now if a U.S. citizen goes to another country.
You have a good section towards the end that basically stating the rest of the country should just let Texas go. And this is a pitch, I don't get often into this discussion with progressives because it's usually not very fruitful, but one of my pitches would be letting us go. Really, if you're a blue state person, a left-winger of progressive in another state other than Texas, that's really a positive outcome, I think, for those people, because without Texas, it's going to be pretty tough to do anything for the Republican Party, or certainly the Libertarian Party, for going forward to win anything. I mean, without Texas, it seems like the Democrats kind of get what they want. And certainly, I've heard many people from blue states now tell me, if you guys ever secede, I'm going there. And so the blue staters get rid of a lot of the people that they would consider gun-toting ignorant Neanderthals. They get rid of them. They all come down to Texas, and they can have their progressive utopia elsewhere in the United States. Do you see that as a positive pitch to the left too, in other states, to just let us go?
Right. And so, I was not, what I was trying to do with this pamphlet was to honestly and sincerely say to everybody involved, hey, somebody's going to get hurt. If we continue on this trajectory, there's going to be open warfare in the streets. I don't necessarily mean between U.S. troops and resistors. I mean more like Antifa types versus Proud Boy, that kind of stuff. Yeah. And as this stuff continues to escalate. And so I was saying, trying to say authentically and sincerely, this is what I'm proposing here, namely an independent Texas, helps everybody. Obviously, it appeals to the people who don't like what the U.S. federal government's doing, or who are aghast at the culture wars and things like that, and say, I don't recognize my country anymore, and let them all flock to Texas. But like you're saying, Buck, so I just had a couple independent arguments, again, trying to appeal to progressives to say, if, let's say, 2/3 of the people in Texas voted to leave, just let them go. And I tried to give a list of reasons why. And one is the thing that you're saying, that you just had Donald Trump recently win, that you think is a cartoonish villain. That's not going to happen anytime soon, or anyone like him, if a lot of, if the people who are for Texas secession would move there. Because, just think, there would be no IRS.
Yeah.
So right there, lots of people would save many thousands of dollars annually on taxes just by relocating. So lots of people would go ahead and do that. And they would tend to be right-wingers. And then for cultural reasons as well. So I was saying right there, if they're going to Texas to be there and renounce their U.S. citizenship, that's good for you. Now you don't have to worry about the presidency anytime soon. And even with state and local politics as well, that there could be this, this really angry minority that always is throwing sand in the gears. Let them go. And then more seriously, people who are worried about, hey, they're going to come take my guns and they're like camping out and drawing lines and saying, just instead of having them do that and you thinking, well, at some point we're going to have to deal with it, just give them this escape valve to say, no, just let them go move to Texas. And then you have to, and then the other thing, now I know people who think the pandemic was exaggerated or, things like that, but for a progressive who thinks Fauci basically is a straight shooter, according to their worldview, a big thing with mutations and the reason everyone is still at risk, even if they've been vaccinated, is because of this, irrational Trumpist minority, but sizable amount who refuse to get vaccinated, and that helps. And I believe just even on their own terms, if there's pockets of unvaccinated people spread around the country, if they all just moved together and lived in one spot, so that the unvaxxed and the vaccinated were all more distinct populations, then there would be fewer mutations. And so, because in the unvaxxed, there wouldn't be the selectionary pressure from having the vaccine people there too. So that you wouldn't have resistant strains emerging as much. So for all these reasons, they should let them go. And then, of course, the number one reason is just consistency, that how could it be that the U.S. preaches democracy and self-determination around the world, and then if a group of people in Texas wanted to leave, we're going to send in troops. Yeah, that doesn't make any sense at all. And so, so I was saying, for all these reasons, progressives, if this were to happen, should let them go.
Yeah, and the biggest stain in the last 20 years, if not a little bit more than that, on the right, even though I don't consider neocons of the right, they've still been the biggest, stain on the right because of what they've done, the evil they've done around the world. If they just flock away from Texas because they can't control this military, what are they going to do with the Texas military? So something to think about for the new right in Texas, who are it's seemingly anti-war these days. What would the money situation look like? And you're a very good one to ask this because of your expertise in economics. What would or what should a money situation look like in an independent Texas?
Okay, great. So so in terms of the progression of the pamphlet and the argument is in the in an earlier chapter, I explained to people in Texas, here's why you should want to sever ties with the U.S. federal government. And one of the main reasons was, look at what the Federal Reserve has done with the dollar. And they've just, after the financial crisis, they had a lot of what was called quantitative easing. And then in 2020, with the coronavirus stuff, the Fed injected so much more money that it even dwarfed what happened after the financial crisis. And at this point, average Americans are seeing it. Gasoline's way up, and regular prices are rising such that even the official organs are admitting that they're now calling it transitory inflation. So it's, people can see that, wow, everything's getting really expensive, and I'm saying that fits the data. And you can see what they've done. And I think the U.S. has gotten by with its historical reputation of being a sound government and system. And so, in other words, like if Venezuela had done with its money supply what the Federal Reserve did with the U.S. dollar, investors would have dumped it and it would have crashed already. And I think the U.S. government just has this prestige and people are giving them the benefit of the doubt. But the more they keep doing this, I think more and more investors are going to realize, no, that's their game plan. They're just going to keep printing dollars until they have to stop because it crashes. And so I was saying to people in Texas, considering this, that's an extra reason you want to insulate yourselves from this system, because this system is going to crash. Wall Street's going to crash. The dollar's going to crash. And so, you want to put up a firewall, as it were, and sever ties while you still can. As far then as, okay, so suppose there is a Republic of Texas and, we don't have a governor anymore. He's like the president of Texas and what should we do? And my advice on this and many other issues, you don't need to do anything. Just people in Texas are adults. They can choose what monies they want to use. Presumably in the beginning, a lot of their transactions will still be denominated in U.S. dollars, but give them the freedom to diversify away from that. And the beauty is, if they don't install an income tax, to replace the federal one, because Texas right now doesn't have a state level one, and so if they just sever that, and I'm strongly suggesting they don't institute an income tax, that right there gives people the freedom to transact in different currencies. Whereas now in the current system, there's a huge handicap that if you're trying to run a business and pay your employees in Bitcoin or gold or something, if you have a stockpile of that in your savings to be able to pay your employees, when it goes up in price measured in US dollars, then that's a capital gain. And so when you get rid of it, you would have to report to the IRS that capital gain. And so that's like an impediment right now to diversifying away into some other currency, again, whether it's gold or silver coins or Bitcoin or what have you, because if you're operating under the US federal income tax. So again, my answer, Buck, is to say let people choose their own currencies. That the Texas government does not need to issue a national currency, and just let people pick what they want. And that will diversify, so you'll be more robust if one of those currencies crashes. You don't have all your eggs in one basket, and people will be able to do that more easily if they don't have an income tax.
I hear this one a lot too, that there's and for my audience listening, Bob covers much of this in his book, and so that's why I'm getting to a lot of these questions. The military base issue, there's a lot of them here in Texas. There are obviously United States military bases. Of course, we've got many of those in countries that aren't our own. How would something like that work?
And you can see the cat was interested in this one. The cat's
yes,
returned.
Cat likes this when he's waving. She.
Yeah. Okay. So So this is a tricky one. So here again, it's not that I have the full blown solution down to the last footnote here, but I think conceptually the way it would work is, number one, a restoration of the Republic of Texas, so that there's no U.S. federal government hanging on top of them, and now it's just their own system. They want to respect legitimate property rights, and so, for example, I said the new Texas government wouldn't want to come in quote, nationalize all of ExxonMobil's holdings in the Permian Basin. Nothing would stop them from doing that necessarily, but if they did that, number one, that would be theft, and number two, that would give a pretext to the U.S. government then to come in and say, hey, this new government's abusing, people that we care about, like the Exxon shareholder. And so you wouldn't want to do that. So property titles should not be getting rearranged just because of this referendum on leaving the Union. And so likewise, everybody agrees right now, like, who owns, an Air Force base that's located in Texas? It's the U.S. federal government. Okay. And so, the actual planes and property, whatever, if everyone agrees, it's the U.S. military, that's their stuff. It's not that the Texas government would then become the owner of that property. However, certainly a sovereign nation, like you said, Buck, can say to the U.S. government, even if in the past they had agreed to let them in, they can change their mind and say, you know what, you guys got to get out. Mm-hmm. And so that, to me, that's what would presumably happen, is if Texans wanted to secede from the Union, they certainly wouldn't want U.S. troops stationed inside their country now. Right. And so they would just inform the U.S. government, okay, now we're independent, we don't want you in here, so start making evacuation plans. And to me, that's that's diplomatically what would happen. Just like if there was a change in regime in some Middle Eastern country, and some they used to have U.S. troops stationed there, and then they said, you know what, the public now, the mood has changed, they want you guys out, so you got to leave. Yeah. And then it might come down to, behind the scenes, are they going to apply pressure? That stuff, presumably in Afghanistan and things for a long time, that's what it was like. But here, again, I think that's what would happen. And again, as long as this stuff, I should stress, the Texans should be very peaceful and orderly about it and transparent, and just say, yep, this is what we decided, so we're going to need you to leave, and make the U.S. be the one to say, no, we're not leaving. And then at least world opinion would know that, oh, these guys are an aggressor. They're occupying, they have hostile occupation power in a land that doesn't want them there. Mm-hmm.
It's interesting because one of the common pushbacks I hear, and you address this too, I think you've addressed this on Twitter as well, I think Malice might have as well, is that, oh my God, the U.S. federal government's not going to let you, they'll send troops in, and it's like, if that's what we're seriously thinking, if you seriously believe that, then we've got a lot of other problems right now. If you think the U.S. military is willing, and it's full of people that are willing to march through Texas streets, killing people or bombing places because people voted to leave.
Yeah, exactly. And so, again, I'm just going to you hit the nail on the head, just rephrase that. Yep, that it is interesting that some people who just poo-poo this thing, this idea from the outset, like, hey, let's not even go down this path because this is irrelevant, or this is a moot point. is they will just say, come on, the U.S. government, they've got nuclear bombs and tanks and whatever. What do you guys got your AR-15s or something? What are you going to do? And like I say, even if that were true, if that's the main thing you're saying, then like, whoa, let's talk about that more. It was never made clear to me growing up that if I wanted to leave, my government would kill me. Like that, that's something we would have talked about, the Soviet Union or whatever. That's what a bad government would do. And so it's interesting to me that for a lot of Americans, it's just so obvious that, of course that's what would happen. And it's like, well, then why are you, shouldn't we discuss that at least and reflect on that? Like, wow, we live under a tyrannical regime, don't we? If the right of self-determination applies everywhere on earth except here, that's an interesting fact in and of itself. And another way to motivate it that I used in the pamphlet was just to say, like, let's, say there was some woman who was with her boyfriend and she was thinking about leaving. And if the reason she didn't leave was because she knew if she tried to break up with him, he would use violence on her, well, then that right there means she needs to break up with him. You know what I mean? And so likewise, if really you're thinking, no, one of the main trump cards in this argument is they would bomb us into submission, well, then that right there proves you're part of this evil system and you need to think about, you could be discreet about it and wise and prudent if violence is waiting in the wings, but that, again, it's not like some flippant point or that's really the thing that bothers me about it is just how flippant and glib they are about it. Like, whoa, if you're saying that, that's a huge admission.
Yes, like it's some obvious thing. We all know they'll just start blowing up schools and stuff like that.
Right.
But Bob, this was solved in 1865. It's set in stone now. No one can secede. We've learned that. That's what they say too.
Yeah, right. Yeah, the way I like when they phrase it is they say, "Didn't the Civil War settle this issue?"
Yeah.
And so so there's different ways of that in general. They're saying might makes right. You wouldn't apply that anywhere else. You wouldn't say if someone wanted to have greater autonomy for Native American tribes.
Right.
Nobody would say, "Didn't the Trail of Tears settle this issue?" Like that would be a horrifying statement. Nobody would talk like that. And yet, for some reason, the fact that this government won a military conflict 100 plus years ago means that therefore, that this isn't an issue anymore and people don't have the right of self-determination because they got crushed with hundreds of thousands of deaths a long time ago. I mean, it's funny that we have to even explain that one, but no, that's not a good argument. And no, a war does not settle a question of rights.
And you go into it, and this is actually, as long as I've been in this has been an interest of mine for multiple years, and I have not read someone put it like you did, with the actual history of Texas and us joining the United States and some of the wording that was used with that. Can you go into some of that? Because I found that interesting, that I wasn't too familiar with it before.
Yeah, let me just pull it up here.
Yeah.
Right, so the first thing a lot of people ask is, would this be legal?
Right.
And so I had a few arguments, and so part of it was just to say, look at if you think that, okay, yes, back then, there was this agreement made and the people of Texas voted to, join the union and so forth. Well, clearly the federal government was promising to abide by the U.S. Constitution. And so we need to ask, have they lived up to their end of the bargain? And I listed some obvious examples in which they haven't. Things like under Obama, they instituted a secret kill list, and that was New York Times front page headline. That's not my conspiratorial phrasing. That's the way the New York Times referred to it, as President Obama's secret kill list, where they could kill U.S. citizens without a trial. It had to do with Al-Qaeda and stuff. If people are wondering how could that be, but it was, openly discussed in the New York Times about how Obama and his staffers would have regular meetings to decide who are we going to put on this kill list next. So that right there should, show people that the U.S. government is not respecting the Constitution, in addition to all sorts of other things. Another example. People asked Nancy Pelosi when the Affordable Care Act was being debated, where in the Constitution does it give the federal government the authority to force people to buy health insurance? And she just went, "Are you serious? Are you serious?" And I have the link to the clip if people want to see the video where, the idea that we would have to justify this, like to her, was hilarious. So clearly the U.S. government's not living up to its end of the bargain. So in that sense, any agreement would be null and void. But beyond that, so when, yes, there was a long process, and I just summarized some of it in the history in this pamphlet. But part of what happened is the U.S. government said to the then Republic of Texas, "You need to come up with a state constitution, and then we will admit you." And so the people had a referendum, and they voted to join, and they ratified this new, state constitution. of eight. So it's the 1845 Constitution of Texas was the one that, the people of Texas ratified, and then the U.S. government approved of. And at that point, it was the Polk administration as part of the process of bringing Texas in. And so they all agreed to this. And one of the things, in the first article of this, so again, this is the 1845 Texas Constitution, it says Section 1, this is just a couple sentences here. All political power is inherent in the people, and all free governments are founded on their authority and instituted for their benefit, and they have at all times the unalienable right to alter, reform, or abolish their form of government in such manner as they may think expedient. Okay, so again, as part of the condition for the U.S. government allowing the then Republic of Texas to come in as a state, they said, you need to come up with a state constitution. They did, and that, what I just read, was in it, and the Polk administration signed off on that. So everybody agreed when they let Texas into the Union with this thing saying that the people of Texas at all times retain their sovereignty and their ability to alter their government as they see fit. So the point being here, it's not just the spirit of the law, but it's also the letter of the law. Clearly, the people of Texas were not, even if you thought it was legitimate that they could bind their great-great-grandchildren into a political union they didn't want, they didn't. They clearly reserved the right for the people of Texas to change their form of government if they wanted to. And so, yes, if the issue is, hey, I don't like the U.S. federal government, but come on, we got to abide by the rule of law. And so, no, that this isn't some extra legal activity, that this was inherent from the beginning.
If you need anything CBD related, I've got the store for you, palomaverdecbd.com, and I've got a promo code for you, BUCK, B-U-C-K. Check out, get you 25% off of your order. They've got everything you'll need that's CBD related. They've got tinctures, they've got salve, they've got these soft gels, they've got an amazing sleep bundle. Check that one out. And I've told you before, the pet stuff, the pet CBD tinctures, the CBD dog chews. My French Bulldog Lux walks like a new man now. A new French Bulldog man, that is. That's because I put it on his food in the morning and in the evening. And now he's got a brother. I've got a new French Bulldog here at the house, George. We've adopted George now. He's 4 years old. I got to put this stuff now in his food so he ages a little bit more gracefully than Lux did. So I'll be going back for more. If you've got a pet, I'm telling you this stuff works wonders. If you got a sore back or you work out a lot and you get sore, I'm telling you I've told you before, the muscle cream works wonders, the sports cream. The sleep pack works wonders, and the promo code works wonders. That's palomaverdecbd.com, promo code BUCK for 25% off of your order. Carlos and Vanessa Abelard of San Antonio that own this business, really great people. They're like-minded. They want to support a show like this that I put out every week for you guys. Give them some business. In turn, it gives me some business. And in turn, I keep cranking out these shows on a weekly basis. palomaverdecbd.com, promo code BUCK for 25% off of your order. Let's get back to the show. Realistic possibility of this happening. I'll preface this with, I actually have bets. I can't remember how much, but it was substantial, within the next 5 years and within the next 10 years with some of my close friends. Realistic possibilities of an actual independent Texas within, I don't know, any timeline you'd like to give if you actually see it happening.
So I do think this is going to happen. I don't think this is just, a theoretical possibility worth exploring. And that's partly why I went from just telling people if they asked me, oh yeah, I'm in favor of secession, but, focusing more on, now let's talk about the minimum wage or something, because I'm an economist, that's the stuff I talk about. Yeah, the reason I decided to write this pamphlet and so on is I think we're at a stage now where people need to be talking about this, and people in Texas need to seriously be thinking through the logistics. Like, suppose in the next election, we did have a referendum and this was approved, what would we actually do? Like, how would we implement this and start having, because there's a lot of thinking that needs to go into this, and, you have the practical considerations and stuff. So I'm saying, let's start doing that. And also to start the national conversation, I want people to be on record, is to say, well, yes, hypothetically, if they were to vote to secede, we would let them go, but that would be a bad idea because that's fine. But I want them on record to admit that, yes, of course, the U.S. government wouldn't drop bombs. That would be immoral. Just to get them on record while it's still hypothetical. Because I think, put it to you this way, as crazy as stuff is right now, imagine 5 years ago if you had asked yourself back then, is the world going to look like this? You know, are people going to be looking to the government to say, do we have the right to have Thanksgiving at our homes?
Yeah.
5 years ago, that would have been inconceivable that would be something that we would be looking to our governors to tell us whether we, could have Thanksgiving or not.
Yeah.
And yet that's where we are. And so, in addition to everything else that's
Yeah.
going on. And so I think that, it's just going to keep accelerating. And because the people on the left, they see that the people on the right are starting to organize, and they're, always like 6 months behind in terms of hitting back
Yeah.
at stuff.
Or
So
6
they have
years.
or
Yeah.
more, depending on the time. So
Yeah.
they have to, keep pushing forward and shocking people with new things to distract them because they've got so
Mhm.
much that they're trying to ram through, I think. And so, yes, I think more and more people, as the level of outrages keeps intensifying, more and more people are going to say, we can't reform this system. We need to just break away. And so, yes, I do think this is going to happen. So the point of doing it this way is to make it more orderly and peaceful, as opposed to it just kind of happening because the system collapses when the dollar crashes. I mean, so that's part of my worldview too, is I think the US dollar is going to crash. Like, there's no doubt in my mind. I don't know exactly when,
Mhm.
but I think once it starts happening, it's going to be a quick unraveling.
Mhm.
And so, at some point when the checks from Washington stop flowing because Washington's broke, because right now they can just print money.
Mhm.
And as long as people keep trusting, like, well, no, I'm sure the people running the Fed aren't crazy, then they can get away with it. But when that confidence is gone, they've lost that. And so then at that point, Washington loses its financial, its ability to buy people off. And then once that happens, I think it's going to be hard for them to hold the coalition together.
Well, that's a good segue towards we're towards the end here, and I have some questions from people that listen to my show that they want me to ask you, if you're okay with that.
Sure.
And you just kind of hinted at it. Of course, if I tell people you're on, I'm going to get some economics questions. Generally, what's going on with the inflation? We all see it now. Like you mentioned earlier, they're telling us it's transitory. Obviously, there's supply chain issues that we're seeing now. Do you think this will get worse before it gets better? And what's the way out of this that you see, if there is one?
Right. So let me just preface this by saying that I famously lost an inflation bet. I think it was back in 2010, right? So I was alarmed at the QE that was happening after the financial crisis. Some other economists one was a literal ANCAP and one was a very limited government minarchist. So these two colleagues of mine bet me because they just disagree with the timeline, and I lost. But so I just want to be clear that I thought conventional price inflation was going to hit sooner than it has, right? So I do want to admit that. But having said that, yes, they're printing money like crazy. We see prices rising. That's normally what you would expect. And so when you couple that, yes, with all of the shutdowns that happened, during the actual lockdown period, and then now still paying workers in many cases more than they were making on the job in unemployment benefits, that's going to have ramifications. You can't just have large segments of the population not going into work and, having ports shut down and whatnot. And then things, in order for the stuff to end up on the shelves at Walmart, there's a lot of things that have to happen, leading up to that. And a lot of those processes have been interrupted. So this is what it looks like. It's almost the flip side, where up till now, most people have just taken for granted all the things that have to happen in a market economy so that the shelves are stocked all the time, and you go in and you see all kinds of different varieties of stuff, and the cashier's there, and it's pretty affordable. Like, that's what we just think of as normal, but it's not automatic. There's a lot of stuff that has to happen, and we've seen now what's going on when those processes get interrupted. So, like I say, the Fed, it's done a lot of stuff. It's not just the quantity of money it's created. For example, it got rid of reserve requirements in March of 2020, meaning that now banks legally don't need to hold money in reserve to back up their loans. So that's a major change. There's lots of the types of assets that the Fed can buy just kept expanding as these crises kept hitting. So it used to be that the Fed basically could buy U.S. treasuries, and that was kind of what it did. Now, anything, they could even buy individual, groups of U.S. stocks if they wanted to, which would have been considered crazy. What an abuse of power, or potential abuse of power, to have the U.S. Federal Reserve, based in New York City, be able to just buy individual corporate stocks. But now that's on the table because everyone's looking to the Fed to bail everybody out. So my long way of answering and saying that, yes, you were seeing the results of price inflation already, and that's their go-to move at this point, is ultimately people are looking at the Fed to be the lender of last resort. And so I think this is just going to get worse before it gets better. The only thing, in other words, that would get them to stop doing this is if there's a big crash in the dollar. Just like the thing, once they went off gold fully in 1971, we had the worst inflationary decade of peacetime U.S. history. And, it took that experience to kind of scare them straight for a bit, with Volcker coming in and slamming the brakes. So I think you're going to see a similar thing here where they're going to let the economy, quote, run hot for a while before they would then slam the brake. Because right now, if they tighten, there's going to be a big financial crash. So they have an incentive to not tighten as long as it doesn't seem too bad. And so right now, it's mostly just people complaining about, wow, stuff's getting really expensive. So I think they're going to let that, anger of the masses intensify somewhat first before they slam the brakes and ruin everybody on Wall Street.
Oof. All right. You had a dust up last week, it seemed, on Twitter. Do you have anything against the post-libertarians, or were you just having fun?
I was being deliberately provocative, but there was substance to it. So, I'll make 2 points. So one is, I was very concerned, or am very concerned, some of their arguments, they're couching it as the non-aggression principle, or the NAP, is like keeping our hands tied, and you NAP worshipers would have us just sit there. And so I wanted to be clear that no, the NAP prevents you from initiating aggression against an innocent third party. And so if you're saying you want to untie our hands by getting rid of the NAP, then you're saying we want to be able to initiate aggression against, people who did not start it with us. And I was just saying, let's be clear about what you're saying there. And so some of the people I was arguing with, when I was saying, so what is it that you want to be able to do? It was things that would be consistent with the NAP. And they were just saying, oh, there happen to be like Rothbardians who don't want to use this strategy, but it wasn't because it was the NAP per se. And so I was just trying to clarify that. But more generally, that yes, in order for stuff like Texas secession, or just, local populism saying, hey, just leave us alone. We don't want to have vaccine mandates or passports in our area, but the general public should not think that you're actively planning violent retribution to get your way, because then that will justify, the feds coming in and doing whatever if they can credibly point and say, look, these guys are saying violence is on the table. Yeah. And so that's what I was saying, both logically, that a lot of what they were saying to me didn't make sense, that no, the sorts of things, if you want to respond to an aggressor, nothing in libertarianism prevents you from doing that. And that saying, hey, we need to have other stuff on the table. And I was saying that, I disagree ethically, number one, but number two, in terms of PR and whatever, no, that's what the federal government wants you to be saying, to then be able to tell the public, so when we crack down, it's because of these guys. And so I'm saying, why would you be talking like that?
Andrew from Popular Liberty, who's considered part of the post-libertarian group, actually has a presentation he calls Aarcotropism, and you actually just stated one of his laws, I think. Basically, he'll use the example of the people on January 6th. When you raise your head up like that, especially if you're a minority trying to kind of aggress, you give the federal government or the powers that be the perfect excuse to start a new war against you, or aggress against you. So I think there might be some agreement in those points, maybe more so than some things. Sometimes.
Let me just mention, just because you brought him up. So I have seen one of the ways he expresses it is he says, so what I'm concerned with is this allergy to aggression on the part of, the NAP-sters or something, or the libertarians. And from his other comments, it's not an allergy to aggression. In other words, I think what he's saying is the types of things he has in mind for what people should be doing, like, taking over the local GOP or whatever.
Yes.
That he's saying that's not aggression, whereas he thinks some libertarians think voting per se is.
Yes.
So I think it's confusing if he frames the issue as these, some of these purist libertarian types have an allergy to aggression, because they say, no, it's not that they're against aggression that's your problem. It's that they are labeling something aggression, which actually isn't.
Correct.
So, and that might just like, oh, you're quibbling over a word, but no, that's kind of important.
Sure.
Because otherwise it sounds like you're saying, let's put initiating aggression on the table of our toolbox. And if that's not what you're saying, then stop saying that, you know?
Yeah. And for instance, I live in Lockhart, Texas. I don't know if you ever came through here, but I'm considering.
You guys got good barbecue there, right?
The best.
Yeah,
It's the
I've
barbecue.
been there for that. So literally, I mean, seriously, that's why I went there.
It's the barbecue capital of Texas, sanctioned by the government. That's not force. I'm considering running for city council and other positions at some point, and I've spoken with people like Tho Bishop, who I'm not going to do this, but who have said a very good strategy would be for someone like you to be the local sheriff. And while that's not particularly my interest, I think that would be extremely valuable to have someone who shares your view, Bob, or my views on generally on liberty and freedom to be the local sheriff. But you do have agorists and or ANCAPs who say, oh my God, you can't be the sheriff. That's not libertarian. That's aggression.
Right. So here we get into a murkier area. So I don't want to, how am I trying to put it? It's confusing because there's lots of different conversations and there's different people talking. And so not everyone, agrees 100% with everyone else. And so sometimes you might say like, oh no, I saw this one guy say this one thing on Twitter and that's who I'm punching against. So I get all that. So yes, it is true that there are certain libertarians who think even just casting a vote, period, is initiating aggression against your citizens, and others disagree with that and so forth. To give an example of the kind of thing I mean, so yeah, I would, when it comes to like resisting a federal vaccine passport, I would have much preferred if like Governor Abbott had said something along the lines of, I don't want any law enforcement at any level in Texas to cooperate with the federal government. No business here will be sanctioned if they fail to, administer a vaccine or to check their customers for vaccine status. If FBI agents come in here, I'm not necessarily saying we're going to arrest them, but we will not cooperate with them. No Texas personnel will cooperate in any way.
Right.
I would have preferred that rather than saying it's illegal for anyone to, because for one thing, this is just a quibble, but that applied to every firm, not just the ones with 100 or more employees. So technically he was, more than counteracting the what was the Biden administration was threatening. But I'm just saying stuff like that in general, I would prefer if it had been a little bit more carefully tailored to show we are merely not cooperating with this federal apparatus coming in, as opposed to we're going to do the mirror image, telling businesses what they need to do, on our own. So stuff like, but you're right. So if someone were to run for sheriff who had really libertarian-esque views and just mostly didn't, we're not going to enforce federal drug laws. You know what I mean? So it's not that we can, quote, make it legal if it's against federal law, but if everybody knows we're not arresting you, our DA is not going to prosecute you or anything, we're not going to cooperate with the feds, it would be hard for the federal government to come in and do something about it.
Mm-hmm. And we will just prosecute or arrest people who violate property rights. Physical.
Right, yeah. We're busy hunting down bank robbers and rapists and stuff like that. We're not going to, some guys growing marijuana, that's not high on our priorities.
Right. And last one, what do you think of the phrase that libertarians in the past and sometimes still say, we are neither left nor right?
So I used to like that, or the way when I was much younger, when sometimes people would summarize it and say, we're fiscally conservative but socially liberal. I understood what they meant by that, because they were trying to say, for the reasons a lot of people don't like big government spending and they don't like, minimum wage laws and whatever. So we're with the, conservative Republicans on that stuff. But then with the other people that say, hey, get the government out of my bedroom, and if what I want to inject into my body is my business, we're with the liberals on that stuff. And it was consistent. It was like, there was a certain symmetry there. Like, oh yeah, why would I let people in Washington, make decisions about my business or my customers or my employees or what I put into my body or who I date? What do they have to do with that? And there was this, but I did a lot of libertarians, though I know, criticize that formulation because it sounds like we don't have our own coherent philosophy, that we're just doing a grab bag of taking, like a buffet, like, oh, I like some of this stuff from the right and we like some of this stuff from the left, as opposed to, no, we're actually being the consistent ones and we have a coherent worldview. And it's actually like the conservatives who are weird that, oh, the U.S. federal government's a bunch of buffoons who are going to wreck the inner city, but let's go remake the Middle East as long as we have some bombers at our disposal. Like, that makes no sense. Or,
Right.
Liberals, wow, America is this white supremacist nation, and that's why we should have the federal government be in charge of healthcare, because, we all want Nazis to be in charge of whether your grandma gets a kidney transplant, right? I mean, that makes no sense. So I understand, the recoiling against that. I suppose it largely depends on who the audience is that you're talking to as to how you explain your viewpoint. If it's somebody who's never heard of libertarianism, maybe, and they just listen to Sean Hannity on the one hand and CNN on the other, maybe it does make sense to try to, extract that. The last thing I'll say on that is, in terms of the culture wars, though, there is a difference between the right and the left.
Yes.
So it's not that that's some artificial thing that the statists have concocted. Like, there really is a difference, and and I side with the right on those sort of cultural issues, and I think to say math isn't racist is more important than the capital gains tax is too high.
Yeah. Yes. I was speaking with Lou Rockwell, and I mentioned that I had told an audience we should quit saying that we're neither left nor right. And he says, very kindly, of course, well, no one else says that besides Walter Block. And I said, sir, a lot of people say it, especially people within the LP. And he says, well, yeah, but they're all leftists. One of my favorite quotes I'll always remember. Bob, I will get you out of here. Plug away, talk about where they can find this ebook we've been discussing the whole time, and plug really anything you want.
Okay, sure. So, if you go to texascommonsense.com, just like it sounds, that redirects, and you can get either just the PDF version, or, like I say, now on Amazon, there's a print-on-demand physical book that's $5, and the Kindle version that's like 99 cents if you want that. So again, texascommonsense.com to see the pamphlet we've been talking about. And then more generally, my podcast, I talk about this and other issues. So that's bobmurphyshow.com.
Excellent. I will link to all of that in the show notes page for this episode. Bob Murphy, thank you, sir, for being on.
Thanks for having me, Buck. It was a pleasure.
Yep. All right, guys. See, if you don't live in Texas, you're going to move here when we secede. And you fellow Texans, hope that got you somewhat optimistic about our future, maybe here in this state. Hope you enjoyed that chat with Bob Murphy. And I was glad to get to bring up the thing about the post-libertarian stuff with Bob. I think this is often the case. Maybe it's just because Twitter, people fire messages back and forth so quickly. Maybe there's not enough allowable space to document what you're trying to say. But I think there's often just a key misunderstanding on a word or two. I think very often more people would agree with the post-libertarians, which I understand that includes me, than not. And often the only disagreement, in my opinion, is strategy. And even within our group, there's disagreements on strategy. We don't all have the same. We're not all just a homogenous blob of crazy people that jump off that card we were talking about earlier. So I was glad to get to chat with Bob about that. And now I want to tell you about the Ron Paul Revolution, a 10-year retrospective with Dr. Paul and the aforementioned early in the show, Tom Woods, down in Lake Jackson, Texas, December 4th, 2021. This is going to be special, guys. This is going to be a very good discussion with Dr. Paul and kind of just a celebration of everything he's been doing for us for a long time. I really urge you guys to get down there to this event. And like I've mentioned on a couple of previous shows, we are having a Counterflow after party. And we did it last year after the event. Now, this event's over like at 2 or 3 in the afternoon. And so we've got a little lake house we've rented out. And if you're interested in joining us after, and this is not Dr. Paul when I say us, I mean the Counterflow crew, we can call it, over at this lake house and have a gathering and have some drinks and talks and discussion about all sorts of things you guys want to talk about, shoot me a message via Twitter is the easiest way that I've found. It's @BuckRebel, BuckRebel. You can shoot me a message there if you're going to be at this event, or find me at the event. You know, we've got to walk around with those "my name is" tags. And so find me there. And if you watch the videos, you'll probably recognize me. And we'll talk about the after party after seeing Tom Woods and the great Dr. Ron Paul. There could be a panel discussion there. That's just a hint. We shall see how that goes. So if you want to do that, hit me up, let me know. Another event that's going to be fun that you should want to do is the Sayulita Super Spreader down in Sayulita, Mexico. This is put on by Johnny from Peddling Fiction. It's going to be really fun. I will be there. Johnny will be there, of course. Michael Rechtenwald will be there. Mark Clare will be there. Clint Russell from Liberty Lockdown. Martha Bueno, James Guzman, and Robbie the Fire Bernstein will be there. How can you not have fun in Mexico with this crew of nomad bandit outlaws, you know? Just Google Sayulita Super Spreader. It's Sayulita. That's Sayulita Super Spreader. Just Google that and you'll figure out how to get there. Every episode up until then of mine, link will be in the show notes page, so you can go down and click on that too. Hope to see you guys down there in Mexico. There's going to be a lot of tequila flowing. I know it's going to be a good time. I think that's about all I got. Join the Telegram group, Counterflow with Buck Johnson. Thank you guys, many of you, for subscribing to the YouTube page. Please do that if you haven't done that yet. And let's see, counterflowpodcast.com is the website. And until next week, you guys have a good one.
You get split in fucking half, till I call him the hologram brass. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Like the sound of the Counterflow podcast? Our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.
This has been the Counterflow Podcast, a part of the Renegade Media Network.